Good day to everybody in all parts of the world. My name is Roger Ames. I'm a professor at Peking University and the senior academic advisor for the Berggruen Research Center at Peking University. The spirit of the Berggruen Institute is this idea, the ideas for a changing world. Our research center is a collection of fellows and is a hub for cross-cultural, interdisciplinary research and dialogue that is really focused on the grand transformations that are affecting the human being. Transformations such as new technologies, artificial intelligence, the interface between artificial intelligence and art, the gene editing, and one very important part of our program is issues that are at the center of global governance and planetary order, taking the world as the world, as opposed to seeing it through Westphalian independent sovereign states. And the goal of the Institute has always been sort of the search for an inclusive, panoramic view on contemporary issues that will generate an intelligent conversation. And that's what our conference series is about. This conference series this particular conference is the third conference in what we call the Tianxia, the all under heaven rubric. And the theme for this conference is formulating a minimalist morality for a planetary order, alternative cultural perspectives. And so we're going to be looking at these issues from a liberal perspective, from Hindu perspective, from Buddhist, Confucian, Taoist, African, Jewish, Japanese, and so on, that we have a very rich program. And so over the next 2 days, at intervals, we'll have 5 sessions. We open with our keynote session today, and then the second session is on the possibility of a minimalist ethic. The third, an ethical and social epistemology for a minimalist ethic. The fourth, liberalism and the alternatives for a minimalist ethic. And then the final session is life forms, social justice, and a minimalist ethic. And so the structure of today's opening keynote session will be the keynote presentation, and then a period of discussion. And then we'll have each of 2 presentations, David Wong and Vrinda Dalmia, where we'll have their presentation followed by questions, presentation followed by questions. So that's the structure that we have today. Now, it gives me a great pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker today, Michael Walzer. If there's anybody who doesn't need an introduction, it's Michael. He's at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. And we all know his work on political theory, on moral philosophy, just and unjust wars, fears of justice. And something interesting, maybe we'll have a chance to ask him about it, but he's working on a new book called The Adjective Liberal. The Adjective Liberal. This is very interesting. And Michael, in addition to being a scholar, is also a public intellectual who we find him across the different forums speaking out on issues that we have to confront today. And so let me turn it over to Michael with his talk on the moral minimum. So Michael?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Roger, and thank you to all the people who have been involved in organizing this remarkable conference. I'm especially grateful for the chance to rehearse and renew arguments that I made a long time ago. And so that will be my project this evening, or for some of you this morning. The moral rules and principles, the ideas about morality that are recognized the world over, not always observed, perhaps not often observed, but understood by men and women across the globe. These ideas, principles are not a global creation. Since the biblical God's creation of the world, there has been no global creativity, no agent or group of agents who could be called the source of our morality. Morality has only local sources, and the same thing can be said of literature, art, music, and even philosophy. All politics is local, famously said Tip O'Neill, a Democratic politician from Massachusetts years ago. The comment is not entirely true. We might better say that politics begins at home, and so does morality. Full-scale moral codes, thick moralities, are created over long periods of time among men and women who share a history, a language, a culture, usually a place in the world. And so are particular understandings of how to interpret the code, who authorize the interpreters, and when exceptions are necessary, and how to put together a persuasive moral argument. The creativity is local, but the developed morality can be valued, translated, adapted, and revised by other groups of men and women living in other places, in other times. Moral ideas, like ideas generally, cross all the borders that divide the world, but they are more often naturalized than simply taken over. They are fitted into an already existing moral culture and changed in the fitting. The world remains plural. It contains difference, different ways of thinking about and making literature, music, and art, different philosophical traditions, and for our immediate purposes today, different ways of judging human behavior. But these different ways overlap, most clearly perhaps in moral life. The fact that we share a common humanity produces again and again similar moral ideas, moral rules. We respond to human traits like lust and greed, and to universal practices like the pursuit of prestige and power, with similar sets of prohibitions against violence and deception especially. And so it's possible to abstract from all the particular moralities a thin universal morality, a moral minimum. Talking of abstraction, though, is too intellectual. It suggests philosophers at work. And the key work here is done by ordinary mortals. Let's say instead that we, all of us, you and I, understand and agree with the claims of strangers that murder and lying and the abuse of the weak by the powerful, all these are wrong. And when we make similar claims, strangers understand them and agree with us. I'm sure there are exceptions, but the agreement here is powerful. This is morality close to the bone. It consists mainly of prohibitions, but it can be expressed positively as the defense, the promotion of life and liberty. It is recognized universally, that's my claim, but it is still subject to local traditions of interpretation and local ways of dealing with moral controversies. The agreement on wrongness is what John Rawls calls overlapping consensus. The moral minimum is my subject today, and I want to defend it against moral universalists who claim that there is or should be or will one day be a full-scale morality accepted by all human beings. And I want to defend it also against moral particularists who believe that a minimal account of morality is likely to underestimate the distinctiveness and value of all the different moral cultures. I'll begin with particularism, since it is regarded by most philosophers as easy to deal with, easy to dismiss. It's commonly identified as relativist. It represents the abandonment of moral judgment. I can imagine a particularism of that sort, holding that difference is all there is, and that we can't say anything more about the many moralities except that they are indeed different from one another. But that's not the only or the necessary version of particularism, and I feel no need right now to engage with it. There are better versions. It's entirely possible, for example, to argue that a culture that allows human slavery is morally worse than a culture that bans slavery. With regard to slavery, it seems to me an easy case. We might establish a hierarchy of moralities. Particularists need only argue that this hierarchy is one among many. There isn't a single hierarchy topped by one moral culture that gets everything right, so that all other moral cultures are judged by how close they get to that one. On different issues, moral cultures score differently. There isn't one definitive ranking. Particular moralities are the creation of men and women trying to live moral lives in company with particular other people. Morality forms part of, perhaps the central part of, a distinctive way of life. It's important to stress that it encompasses not only high principles, which are probably widely shared, but also what we might call moral etiquette. It determines how we talk to, how we deal with, relate to strangers, neighbors, friends, colleagues at work, and relatives, blood kin, and in-laws. The rules can be quite elaborate, so that visitors from other places will get things wrong again and again. Migrants forcibly displaced or just out of place will have to learn new ways. Anthropologists will take an interest. They tend to be champions of the idea of cultural difference. I've identified moral culture with geographical place, but the identity is in fact uncertain, radically uncertain. The division of the world into nation states coincides only roughly, very roughly, with the pluralism of moralities. We might say of some countries that they have a particular moral culture, just as we sometimes talk about their national character. But we also identify moral cultures with much more vaguely defined places, as when we describe Western or Asian values. Still, I think that defenders of moral particularism are likely to be defenders also of the Westphalian system of sovereign nation states, as if political self-determination and moral creativity go together. Sometimes, perhaps, they do. Certainly, nationalists generally argue that they do. But a straightforward national and moral particularism doesn't fit the world we live in. Nations change over time. Borders are revised by diplomacy and war. Migrants arrive. Populations mutate. Many things remain the same, but many things don't. Moral cultures not only overlap, they also interact. They influence each other through intercultural exchanges of admiration and criticism. Their most creative members produce new versions of the local culture, mixing and merging moral ideas. Think, for example, of how Thomas Aquinas created an Aristotelian Christianity and how Reform Judaism took in the values of the European Enlightenment. The moralities of our world are indeed distinctive, but they are not distinct. That's why it's possible to imagine a thin or minimal morality that is recognizable, understandable across more political and cultural borders. I find it difficult, however, to imagine a full-scale morality, a thick or maximal morality that is similarly recognizable everywhere. There are many people, philosophers especially, who believe that for any moral dilemma or political argument, there is one and only one right answer, an answer that should win universal agreement, but obviously doesn't. The goal of political theory and moral philosophy, then, is to get the answer right and to persuade other people to get it right. It must seem odd to people engaged in this eternal pursuit of rightness that so many other people over so many centuries have gotten it wrong, or mostly wrong, or partly wrong. The many answers must be wrong simply because they are many, whereas the right answer would have to be singular. Human creativity accounts for the differences. I suppose that it's possible to imagine each creation as an effort to get things right. And then it should be possible to survey all the efforts, see where they go wrong, and produce the final creation that gets everything right, not only the big things, but everything. To see where the various moral creations have gone wrong, however, we would already need the final creation. And all we actually have are all the different ones, the earlier ones. In any case, how can we expect finality as long as creative human beings are busily at work? Isn't this something like architects studying all the buildings that have ever been built in order to come up with the one perfect building? And after that, there would be no need for architectural innovation. We could just build the one perfect building over and over again. Why isn't architecture like that? Or imagine the philosopher who finally gets our morality right and puts all the other philosophers out of work forever. In fact, this is not imaginable. The same argument against finality applies also to political philosophy and to politics itself. We can certainly imagine better and worse political arrangements with regard to different issues, but I don't think that a single arrangement with regard to all issues is imaginable. Or I should say more accurately, it is only imaginable. It is a utopian fantasy. How could there be one right regime such that once it is discovered, all arguments about political organization would be superfluous? Political philosophers would just repeat themselves, describing the one way, the only correct way of organizing political life. There might still be room for local color, for differences at the margin, and for occasional reality-driven adjustments, but not much opportunity for political invention. I am confident, however, I really believe that political invention has a future and that it is likely to surprise us. If there actually was a global state, then of course there'd be only one political regime, or one at a time anyway. But I would still expect ongoing arguments within that political regime about how actually it should be organized, how it should be shaped, who does what to whom. And when the arguments get fierce, there might well be civil wars and secessions. Moral particularists would probably feel at home with that outcome, even though they would certainly try to avoid the wars. They are, as I have already said, likely to favor something like a society of separate and sovereign states. Moral universalists, by contrast, would probably be drawn to the idea of a single global state, perhaps even to the idea of a single state with the one correct regime, so that it would be proof against disputation and breakup. Let's call that the cosmopolitan position. Probably the philosophical favorite, though different philosophers would qualify it in different ways, in multiple ways. Particularism points towards something like a nationalist politics, not necessarily chauvinist or ultranationalist. And the moral minimum fits best, it seems to me, with an old-fashioned left internationalism. So I want to argue now that the many global problems that we need to address can best be addressed, and in any case have to be addressed, within an internationalist version of global politics, which rests on some version of a minimal morality. But that position certainly isn't obvious. It needs argument. After all, the most critical problems have to do with war and climate change. And it seems clear, despite my own predilections, that a global state could best deal with those two. Even if it was beset with dissension, internal division, and secessionist movements, such a state would presumably have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force and a near monopoly on its actual use. It would have a judicial system capable of adjudicating disputes, and it would have police and soldiers capable of enforcing the decisions of the courts. It would have an executive power. Conventional wars, at least, would no longer be possible. And similarly, the very tough decisions required to meet the challenge of global warming could be taken by a single government through processes universally recognized to be legitimate. And then all the agencies of this government and all its powers could be mobilized to carry out those decisions. It's hard to see how phenomena that are indeed global in character can be dealt with in any other way. So all that is true in theory, as we say, true in theory. But a state whose authority is global, whose writ runs everywhere in the world, isn't a practical option. And the reason for that is simple. The world isn't a political place. The world isn't a political place. So what is a political place? It is a physical, a geographical space in the world where a group of people have been able to shape, to create a common life. They are likely to share a single language in which politics is conducted. There are only a few exceptions involving two languages reflecting regional divisions and a capital city in which both are spoken. But the overwhelming majority of political places are places whose inhabitants share a single language. And they will also be marked by a common history and a common political culture, arrangements and practices that everyone or almost everyone understands and accepts, so that they would say, this is the way we do things here. Without some version of all this, it isn't possible for men and women to argue among themselves, for arguments work only if there are underlying agreements. It isn't possible for them to argue among themselves and to reach decisions that seem legitimate to all of them, to everyone involved. But these political places, like the morality, art, and literature created within them, are not isolated from one another, from all the other places. Populations overlap or intermix. Every place contains minority groups that may represent some other place's diaspora. People come and go, visiting and trading, staying on and moving on. The local arrangements and the men who run them are tested by how well, how fairly they deal with strangers. One might say that the minimal morality is created or invented by the people who come and go. Or better, these people are the ones who discover the overlapping consensus and defend it against those long-time inhabitants, the natives, who seek ethnic or cultural or religious homogeneity in what they insist is their own place. So now let's call the political places nation states. The people defending a singular identity are nationalists or ultranationalists. And the ones who come and go, the strangers, they are the first internationalists. But a full-scale internationalism comes only when enough of the nationalists, the natives, recognize people like themselves in other political places and seek to act together with them. Minimal morality makes possible, or perhaps it simply is, the recognition of strangers everywhere as fellow humans, the people who come and go, and also the inhabitants of foreign places who stay where they are. All of them are very much like us. They are men and women with whom we are, or with whom we can be, morally engaged. Particular engagements call for solidarity both within and across political places, as when aid is delivered to victims of earthquakes or hurricanes nearby and far away. Or, in theory more than practice, when political projects are shared or thought to be shared across borders, as in the failed case of the international working class, the Socialist International, during the First World War. Indeed, solidarity across borders has failed many wartime tests, not only that one. And yet, every effort to avoid war, every diplomatic alliance, every attempt at global justice, every league or union of nations has been the work of separate and sovereign nation states negotiating with each other, trying to promote some kind of common enterprise across their borders. These states don't aim at the abolition of particular political places, their own abolition. They don't aim at the erasing of borders. They aim at concerted action across borders, which is what internationalism must produce if it is to meet the challenges of war and climate change. Thus far in world history, none of these internationalist efforts has succeeded except in very partial ways. The UN, the United Nations, is the most recent example of the inability of the existing nation-state system, which is more like a global anarchy, to manage concerted action across borders. Hence the demand for the transcendence of borders and the transcendence of internationalism. But even transcendence would require decisions in each separate state to abandon its own local arrangements and practices, decisions that are highly unlikely. Or it would require the conquest of all the sovereign states by one super state. World empire is easier to imagine than world democracy or any global union founded on universal agreement. And yet we have seen one regional union, the European Union, more or less democratic, which involves a partial surrender of local decision-making. I think of the European Union as an experiment in internationalism. It's an enhanced internationalism. And it is challenged, obviously, by Brexit, which posed the key questions. Is Europe a political place? And can we imagine a hierarchy of political places and a division of decision-making such that local loyalties, like those of the French, the Germans, and the Poles, are respected, and at the same time, new and wider European loyalties are created? If we are to deal with the climate crisis democratically, it will require decisions in each of the existing political places to cooperate in the creation of regional and global agencies with agreed upon coercive powers, perhaps something like what the European Union has or hopes to have. Thinking about how such agencies might be created, I was reminded of Thomas Hobbes's account. Long ago, I taught seminars on Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes's account of how state sovereignty originated. It began, he suggests, in the state of nature, with the recognition of mutual danger. Human beings are equal in their ability to kill each other, whether by strength or stealth, and so they need a power that can restrain them all and guarantee their physical security. That's Hobbes's basic argument. Today, all the nation states, and all the minorities and all the diasporas that constitute the global anarchy are at risk from climate change, and all of them would benefit from, I should say, all of them need a power or a set of powers that can control the rate of change and assist in local adaptations to it. Hobbes thought that political absolutism was the only way out of the state of nature. And that may turn out to be the only way out of global anarchy. But it did happen that there were other ways of coping with the risks that individuals pose to each other when they interact naturally in the state of nature, including liberal and democratic ways. Men and women in many political places found those alternative ways because the fear of death wasn't their single or paramount motive, as Hobbes thought. They were also motivated by the love of liberty. Together, they have worked out many different political arrangements, and in all of them, the minimal morality of life and liberty points towards something short of Hobbist absolutism. In a similar way, we have to believe that something short of global empire will allow us to cope with the risks of climate change. And the only place where we can pursue the possibility of escaping anarchy, the global state of nature, the only place where we can campaign for and enable concerted action across borders, that place is our own political place, our own nation state. For better or worse, that has to be where an enhanced internationalism and effective climate control begins begins. Now, I should be more precise. The political struggles over carbon emissions, over investment in alternative energy sources, over the future of the automobile, and much else, are now and will be for the foreseeable future local struggles. They will shape and be shaped, we hope, be shaped by international efforts to set goals, to ensure justice and reciprocity, to monitor local successes and failures. But the social movements and the political leaders who favor tough measures of climate control will have to fight for political support. They will have to win elections in this political place, in this nation state, and then in that one, and that one, and that one. We reach toward internationalism, but the forcefulness of the reach will be locally determined. The argument about war can't be very different from this. Of course, the creation of a global state or empire would, as I've said, end the conventional wars of our own time, wars between states, wars between state-organized armies. Internal dissension would take its place, and I expect the dissension would often be deadly, but that doesn't matter, since in any case, there is no global state and conventional war is still our lot, as the current Russo-Ukrainian war demonstrates. Even in today's global anarchy, we know, I'm making an argument now that some people may not accept, we know how to deal with wars of this sort. We do it or try to do it, guided by the minimal morality of international law and just war theory. Both of these point toward what I've been calling internationalism, the recognition of agencies that can act in a concerted way across borders. But these agencies have no well-established institutional form. The International Criminal Court is a useful example. It is the judicial branch of a global state that doesn't exist. There are no effective legislative or executive branches. And so the ICC can only pretend to act justly. Actual justice depends on the commitment of nation states, or at least the leading ones. And I will use here the example of Nuremberg in 1945. The London Conference of that year provided something like a legislative authorization for the Nuremberg trials, and the agreement of the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France provided the executive power that brought all the indicted persons to Nuremberg and enforced the final verdicts. Similar ad hoc arrangements made possible the trials that followed the wars of the former Yugoslavia. Justice in war making, justice against war making, requires a similarly collective and similarly ad hoc response to military aggression. The European response to the Russian attack on Ukraine is obviously a partial rather than a global effort. It relies on agencies like NATO and the EU, but it is nonetheless the morally right effort. It is an example of solidarity across borders. Peace begins with the defeat of aggression, and there can be no lasting peace unless there is a strong expectation of collective action against future aggression. The condemnation of aggressive war making is one part of the minimal morality of international society. The other part has to do with the conduct of war, And it would require, in my view, the condemnation of the total war that Russia is at this moment waging in Ukraine. We haven't yet found a way to make either part of that morality fully enforceable. The fact that Ukraine has received regional but not global support is evidence that we are somewhere less than halfway to the arrangements that we need. But we know what those arrangements are. So I believe. And if there were political liberty in China today, I am sure there would be men and women arguing strongly for a Chinese condemnation of Russian aggression. There would be disagreement, but that argument would be understood, would be comprehensible to everyone. If there were global support for something like what used to be called collective security, a global version of collective security, if those arrangements could be defended in one state after another, then we might be able, I believe, to have something roughly like peace in our time. And this would be a peace along with an international society of independent, self-determining, potentially democratic nation states able to project agreements across borders. No world empire would be necessary. In Thick and Thin, I described, that was my book of 1994, I described and defended the universality of a thin or minimal morality, the best guide that we have when we act in the wider world with men and women who are political, cultural, or religious strangers. Thick moralities, I argued, are created in and for domestic society. Local systems of distributive justice provide a useful example. I have continued that argument here, defending the moral minimum as the necessary morality of global interaction against local examples of moral maximalism that exist, that aren't familiar or persuasive to the rest of us, and against the fully worked out moral universalism that doesn't exist and isn't imaginable or is only imaginable. Similarly, I have defended an internationalist politics against nationalism and ultranationalism that make for exclusion and war, and against the idea of a global state that would almost certainly be, if it ever came into existence, the soulless despotism that Immanuel Kant described long ago. The moral minimum is a morality we all know. Internationalism is a politics within our reach. As we work for a peaceful and livable world, these are the only tools we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael.